cannot hear the voices of comfort or warning, where darkness and silence close in on you completely. For young Helen, the world became a confusing storm of sensations she could not understand. She stumbled through her days, frustrated, unable to communicate her needs or feelings. Her family loved her, but they were helpless. Without a way to reach her mind, Helen seemed destined to live in isolation, locked away in her own body. By the age of 6, her behavior grew wild and uncontrollable. She screamed, kicked, and threw fits when she could not express herself. She was smart, but she was trapped. Neighbors whispered that she was hopeless, that she could never learn, that she would live her life in shadows. Her parents, though heartbroken, refused to give up. They searched desperately for help, clinging to the faintest hope that someone, somewhere, could find a way to reach their little girl. What they did not know was that this seemingly hopeless child was not broken. Inside Helen burned a fierce spirit, a hunger for connection, and a determination that no darkness could extinguish. All she needed was a teacher, a guide, someone who believed that the impossible was possible. And soon, that person would arrive. Helen's early years remind us of something powerful. Every life, no matter how limited it may appear, carries within it the seed of greatness. Sometimes circumstances surround us with walls of silence and darkness, but those walls are not permanent. They are waiting to be broken. Helen Keller's life began with tragedy, but it was not tragedy that defined her, it was the fire that tragedy awakened inside her. By the time Helen was nearly 7 years old, her parents were desperate. They had tried doctors, specialists, and schools, but no one seemed to know how to reach a child who was both deaf and blind. The world saw her as a lost cause, a little girl destined to live out her days in silence, imprisoned in her own mind. But Helen's mother refused to accept this fate. She read about a school in Boston for the blind, and she wrote letters begging for help. Her cry for hope was answered in the form of a young teacher named Anne Sullivan. Anne Sullivan was only 20 years old when she came into Helen's life. She was not much older than Helen herself, and she carried her own scars of suffering. And had grown up in poverty, nearly blind herself from a childhood disease, and had endured hardships that hardened her spirit into steel. She knew what it meant to struggle, to be underestimated, to fight for every inch of progress. And because of her own pain, she saw something in Helen that others could not see, not a hopeless child, but a soul waiting to be unlocked. When Anne first met Helen in March of 1887, she did not see a wild, uncontrollable child, she saw potential. Helen, curious yet defensive, reached out and touched Anne's face, her clothes, her bag, trying to understand who this stranger was. That day marked the beginning of one of the greatest partnerships in history. Anne became more than a teacher, she became Helen's bridge to the world. Anne's methods were revolutionary. She used touch as the key to communication. With infinite patience, she began spelling words into Helen's hand, tracing letters with her fingers. She spelled doll into Helen's palm, placing a doll in her hands so she could connect the feeling of the object with the word. At first, Helen copied the motions but did not understand. She thought it was a game. She could memorize the patterns but had no concept that these patterns represented ideas, names, or language. Progress was painfully slow, and Helen grew frustrated. But Anne Sullivan refused to give up. Day after day, hour after hour, she worked with Helen, never losing faith. She endured Helen's tantrums, resistance, and tears, believing that beneath the storm there was brilliance waiting to break through. Where others saw a wall, Anne saw a door. Where others gave up, Anne pressed on. She once said, "Children require guidance and sympathy far more than instruction." She gave Helen not just lessons, but love, patience, and unshakable belief. It was a battle of wills, Helen's stubborn spirit against Anne's relentless determination. Yet this struggle was not one of opposition, but of transformation. Anne knew that if she could just light the first spark of understanding, Helen's world of silence and darkness would explode into meaning. And soon, that miracle was about to happen. Anne Sullivan's arrival was proof of a powerful truth. Sometimes in life, the right person at the right time can change everything. No one is truly lost as long as there is someone who believes in them. Helen had been trapped, but with Anne by her side, the lock on her prison was beginning to turn. For weeks, Anne Sullivan poured her energy into teaching Helen words through touch. She spelled doll, mug, bread, milk into Helen's palm again and again. Helen learned to mimic the movements but grew frustrated, unable to grasp their meaning. She could repeat the motions, but to her they were only shapes, empty and confusing. The concept of language, of words as symbols for the world, seemed beyond her reach. To those watching, it looked hopeless. But Anne believed that Helen was closer to understanding than anyone realized. The moment of transformation came on a warm spring day in April 1887, outside the Keller family home. Helen was led to the old water pump in the yard, where Anne placed one of Helen's small hands under the gush of cool water. At the same time, with the other hand, Anne spelled into Helen's palm, water. Over and over, as the fresh stream rushed across Helen's skin, and traced the letters again and again, water. Suddenly, something extraordinary happened. A spark of recognition burst inside Helen's mind. For the first time, she understood that the patterns Anne was making in her hand stood for the cool, refreshing liquid flowing over her fingers. The symbols had meaning. The floodgates of her mind opened, and light poured into her darkened world. Helen froze, her face transforming with awe. She pulled at Anne's hand, demanding more. Anne spelled water again, and Helen nodded, grasping it with a joy that words could never fully describe. That day, Helen's spirit ignited. She ran from object to object, touching the ground, the tree, the pump, the doll, demanding that Anne spell their names into her hand. Each new word was not just a word, it was a key unlocking her mind, a bridge connecting her to life itself. By nightfall, Helen had learned 30 words. In a single day, she went from isolation to connection, from frustration to discovery, from silence to the first notes of a language that would change her life forever. The water pump became more than a place to draw water, it became a symbol of rebirth. It marked the moment when Helen Keller was truly born into the world of knowledge and communication. For the first time, she realized that everything around her had a name, and that names gave her power. Power to ask, to learn, to connect, to grow. The barrier of darkness and silence that had imprisoned her was shattered, and the world opened before her like a door she never knew existed. This single moment carries a timeless lesson. Breakthrough often comes after long seasons of struggle. Helen endured years of isolation before that spark of understanding arrived. And endured weeks of rejection before she saw the miracle. And when it came, it changed everything. Their persistence proved that even the thickest wall can be broken with enough patience, love, and determination. The water pump story is not just Helen's, it belongs to everyone who has ever felt stuck, hopeless, or lost. It reminds us that no matter how dark the night, one spark of understanding, one act of faith, one moment of persistence can flood your world with light. After the miraculous breakthrough at the water pump, Helen's world transformed almost overnight. The little girl who once raged in silence and confusion now became insatiably curious, desperate to learn everything around her. The spark of understanding had ignited a wildfire in her mind. With Anne Sullivan at her side, she threw herself into this new universe of language with passion and hunger. Each day, Helen would rush to touch objects, stones, flowers, furniture, clothing, food, and pull Anne's hand, demanding to know the name. Anne would patiently trace the letters into her palm, and Helen would repeat them, storing them carefully in her memory. Words were no longer meaningless patterns, they were keys, unlocking the secrets of her environment. By the end of the first week after her breakthrough, Helen had already learned hundreds of words. But Helen wanted more than just names. She wanted to understand ideas. She wanted to grasp concepts. She discovered that words could describe not just objects but also actions, emotions, and even invisible things like love and thought. And taught her by connecting feelings and experiences to language. For love, and spelled the letters into Helen's palm while hugging her tightly. For think, she tapped her forehead, then spelled the word. Each time, Helen's understanding grew deeper, and her excitement grew brighter. Her progress shocked everyone around her. The child once thought incapable of learning was racing ahead, mastering communication faster than most sighted and hearing children her age. She was living proof that limitations do not define potential. Every day, she pushed the boundaries of what others believed possible. Helen herself described this period as if a door had opened, and I stepped into a bright, new world, where everything had meaning. For the first time in her life, she could express her thoughts, her feelings, and her dreams. She could connect with her family, with Anne, and with the world beyond her darkness. No longer trapped in silence, she had found her voice not through sound, but through touch, through words spelled into her hand, words that carried the power of freedom. Anne Sullivan continued to pour herself into Helen's education. She lived with her, worked with her tirelessly, teaching her not only words but also manners, values, and discipline. She challenged Helen, never allowing her to settle, always pushing her to go further. What made their relationship extraordinary was not just teacher and student, it was soul and soul. Anne gave Helen patience, faith, and opportunity. Helen gave Anne purpose, love, and proof that miracles are possible through persistence. This explosion of learning was more than education, it was liberation. Helen Keller was no longer a prisoner of her disabilities, she was a pioneer, boldly stepping into a future where nothing seemed impossible. With every word she learned, she was proving a truth that echoes through history: the human spirit, once awakened, is unstoppable. With the doors of language thrown wide open, Helen's hunger for knowledge only grew fiercer. She did not just want words, she wanted to read them, write them, and live inside them. Books, which had once been meaningless bundles of paper, now called to her like treasures waiting to be unlocked. Anne Sullivan, ever patient and determined, was ready to guide her down this new path. And introduced Helen to raised print books, where the alphabet was formed in large embossed letters she could feel with her fingertips. At first, Helen traced the shapes slowly, matching them with the words she had already learned in her palm. The process was painstaking, but Helen's persistence was unshakable. Soon, she was not only recognizing words but stringing them together into sentences, and sentences into meaning. What others learned by sight, Helen learned by touch, and her joy was boundless. But she did not stop there. With Anne's encouragement, Helen learned to write. Using special tools that guided her hand, she began forming letters on paper. Her first sentences were simple, but each one was a victory. To Helen, writing was more than communication, it was freedom. For the first time, she could record her thoughts, her ideas, her questions. It was proof that her mind, once thought unreachable, was alive with intelligence and imagination. As Helen mastered reading and writing, her world expanded beyond her home in Alabama. Through books, she traveled across oceans and centuries. She touched the words of Shakespeare, Homer, and the Bible, and though she could not see or hear them, she felt their beauty in her hands. Literature became her window to history, philosophy, and art. She once said, "Literature is my utopia. Here I am not disenfranchised. No barrier of the senses shuts me out from the sweet, gracious discourses of my book friends. They talk to me without embarrassment or awkwardness." Helen's passion for learning soon revealed something extraordinary. Her memory was astonishing. She absorbed knowledge with a sharpness and clarity that surprised even the most skeptical teachers. What had once been seen as her greatest weakness was transforming into her greatest strength. Cut off from the distractions of sight and sound, Helen's focus was laser-sharp, her determination unmatched. Anne Sullivan remained by her side every step of the way, spelling out entire lessons in Helen's hand, reading to her tirelessly, and refusing to let her settle for enough. She believed that Helen was destined for greatness, and Helen, in turn, believed in herself because Anne never doubted her. By her teenage years, Helen's mastery of reading and writing astonished the academic world. The little girl once dismissed as unteachable was proving to be one of the most brilliant students of her time. Her achievements sent a clear, resounding message to the world: disability does not mean inability. With determination, guidance, and faith, the mind can soar far beyond the limitations of the body. This stage of Helen's life was not just about education, it was about destiny. She was no longer simply learning words and books. She was preparing herself to step into history, to become not just a student but a leader, not just a reader but a voice for millions who could not speak for themselves. By the time Helen Keller was in her teenage years, her progress had already defied every expectation. She could read, she could write, she could communicate with the world in ways that once seemed impossible. But Helen's dreams were far bigger than mastering the basics. She wanted to pursue higher education, to go to college, a goal that had never before been attempted by someone both deaf and blind. To many people in the late 1800s, the idea was outrageous. Colleges were not designed for the blind, let alone for a student who could neither see nor hear. The challenges seemed overwhelming. How would she follow lectures? How would she take notes? How could she keep pace with sighted, hearing students? Skeptics shook their heads, insisting it could not be done. But Helen did not measure her life by the doubts of others. With Anne Sullivan by her side, she dared to dream what no one else thought possible. Together, they began preparing for this audacious goal. Anne would continue to spell every lecture, every lesson, every page of text into Helen's palm. It was exhausting work, but neither of them flinched. Helen's determination was matched by Anne's sacrifice. Day after day, Anne served as Helen's eyes and ears, translating entire textbooks word by word into Helen's hand. They studied for hours on end Latin, French, Greek, mathematics, philosophy, history, subjects that most sighted students found difficult. Helen absorbed it all with relentless focus. In 1900, Helen achieved what the world had thought impossible. She entered Radcliffe College, the sister school of Harvard University, becoming the first deafblind person in history to be admitted. It was a triumph not just for her but for humanity itself. Her admission sent a thunderous message: no barrier of the body could silence the brilliance of the mind. College life was not easy. Helen had to keep up with constant lectures, assignments, and exams. Anne, often exhausted to the point of collapse, spelled every word into Helen's hand. They were inseparable, working as one. There were nights when Anne's fingers ached from endless spelling, and days when Helen's mind felt overwhelmed by the weight of information. Yet neither complained. They were on a mission larger than themselves. Helen's classmates, initially unsure of how to approach her, grew to admire her perseverance and courage. Professors, once doubtful, came to respect her intellect and discipline. She was not just keeping up, she was excelling. She devoured literature, philosophy, and political theory with the same hunger she had shown as a child at the water pump. In 1904, Helen Keller graduated from Radcliffe College cum laude, a historic achievement that made headlines across the nation. She had done what no one before her had ever dared, proving that education belongs to all who seek it, not only to those blessed with sight and sound. Her college years cemented her place in history. But more importantly, they prepared her for the mission that would define the rest of her life, not simply to overcome her own challenges, but to inspire millions to overcome theirs. Helen once said, "College is not the end of the road, but the beginning of a life of service." Her story at Radcliffe was not about one woman's victory alone. It was about a universal truth: the greatest obstacles in life are not physical, they are the walls of doubt, fear, and limitation we build in our own minds. Helen Keller tore those walls down and walked through the gates of knowledge, leaving them open for generations to come. Graduating from Radcliffe College in 1904 was not the end of Helen Keller's journey, it was the launching point. With her degree in hand, she had proven to the world that the impossible could be made possible. But Helen knew her education was not only for her own advancement. She carried a greater responsibility, one that burned in her heart: to speak for those who could not, to fight for the millions living in silence, poverty, and neglect. Helen Keller became not just a scholar but an advocate, activist, and pioneer. She understood suffering in ways that most people could not, and she refused to let her personal triumphs remain private victories. Instead, she turned them into a platform to uplift others. She once said, "Alone we can do so little, together we can do so much." These words became the foundation of her life's mission. Through Anne Sullivan's tireless interpretation, Helen began giving lectures and writing books. The sight of a woman who could not see or hear standing before crowds, delivering wisdom and courage, electrified audiences. People came from across the world to hear her story, to witness proof that human spirit could transcend the harshest limitations. Helen spoke passionately about the rights of the blind and the deaf. She urged governments to invest in education, employment opportunities, and healthcare for the disabled. At a time when people with disabilities were often hidden away or ignored, Helen declared boldly that they deserved dignity, respect, and equal opportunities. But her vision did not stop at disability rights. Helen also became a champion for justice, peace, and equality. She spoke against child labor, supported women's suffrage, and advocated for workers' rights. Her activism was not always popular. Her strong political stances often drew criticism, but Helen was fearless. Having already conquered the prisons of silence and darkness, she would not be silenced by society. Her books, including The Story of My Life, 1903, inspired millions and continue to inspire readers today. In her writings, she revealed not only her struggles but also her philosophy of courage and resilience. She reminded people that character cannot be developed in ease and quiet. Only through experience of trial and suffering can the soul be strengthened, ambition inspired, and success achieved. By becoming a public figure, Helen Keller gave a face, a voice, and a soul to people who had long been forgotten. She embodied the truth that those once dismissed as disabled could lead, inspire, and transform the world. Her courage shook governments, changed policies, and ignited movements that would ripple through generations. Anne Sullivan remained at Helen's side throughout this journey, spelling speeches and conversations into her palm, helping her navigate the world of politics and advocacy. Together, they were an unstoppable force, and the tireless guide, and Helen, the radiant light shining for millions. This stage of Helen's life showed that true greatness is not found in personal victories alone but in lifting others with you. Helen had overcome her own silence and darkness, but her greatest triumph was helping others believe that they could too. By the time Helen Keller had established herself as a writer, lecturer, and advocate in America, her reputation had already spread far beyond her homeland. But Helen's mission was never limited by borders. Her vision was as vast as the human spirit itself. She believed that hope, dignity, and opportunity were not privileges for a few but rights for all. And so, with Anne Sullivan by her side, she began a new chapter of her life, carrying her message to the world. In the early 1920s, Helen joined the American Foundation for the Blind, and through this work, she traveled extensively across the United States and then across continents. She spoke in schools for the blind, in hospitals, in government halls, and even before kings and presidents. Wherever she went, she carried the same message: the only thing worse than being blind is having sight but no vision. Her words ignited fires of hope in hearts that had long gone cold. Helen visited 35 countries on 5 continents, often greeted by cheering crowds who saw in her not a disabled woman but a living miracle, proof that the human soul could rise above every obstacle. In Japan, she was treated like royalty, inspiring a nation recovering from war. In India, she met Mahatma Gandhi, finding common ground in their shared belief in peace and human dignity. In Europe, she urged leaders to see beyond politics and to consider the forgotten souls living in poverty and darkness. Everywhere she went, Helen's presence was magnetic. People wanted to touch her hand, to feel the strength of the woman who had defeated silence and blindness. They did not see her as fragile or limited, they saw her as limitless, a messenger of courage who had crossed barriers most thought unbreakable. Her speeches, delivered through interpreters and Anne Sullivan's patient spelling, were not filled with self-pity or sorrow. Instead, they overflowed with optimism, determination, and a call to action. Helen reminded the world that the true measure of a society was how it treated its most vulnerable. She demanded that nations see the blind and the disabled not as burdens but as citizens capable of contribution, creativity, and greatness. But her global tours were not just about advocacy, they were about connection. Helen showed people that courage and resilience were universal languages. Whether she was speaking in New York or Nairobi, Tokyo or Tehran, her story resonated because it was the story of overcoming despair, of choosing hope, of refusing to surrender. Anne Sullivan remained her constant partner on these journeys, though her health began to decline from years of strain. Yet even as Anne's strength weakened, her spirit did not. Together, they proved to the world that friendship, faith, and shared purpose could conquer distances, disabilities, and even time itself. By the mid-20th century, Helen Keller was no longer just an American figure, she had become a global icon of hope, a woman whose name symbolized the power of perseverance. She had stepped out of silence and darkness, not only for herself but for millions across the world who needed to believe that light was still possible. Her international journeys left behind more than speeches. They planted seeds of change, new schools for the blind, new laws for disability rights, and new generations of dreamers who carried her example forward. Helen's story reminded the world that true greatness is not confined by circumstance, but defined by courage. As Helen Keller grew older, her life story had already become legend. Yet she never slowed down, never retreated into comfort, and never let age dull her purpose. Even in her later years, she remained a woman of vision, not sighted vision, but the greater vision of the heart and soul. She had faced silence and darkness, conquered barriers, and inspired millions, but her mission was not finished. Helen understood that legacies are not built in one moment of triumph, they are built over a lifetime of service. In the 1930s and 1940s, while the world was shaken by depression and war, Helen stood as a beacon of hope. She continued to write, delivering essays and books that touched lives across the globe. She reminded people that hardship was not the end of the road, but the beginning of transformation. When the Second World War left thousands of soldiers blinded and broken, Helen visited hospitals, comforting them with her presence. She held their hands, spelled encouragement into their palms, and reminded them that blindness was not the end of usefulness or dignity. To men who felt hopeless, she gave back courage. To families who felt abandoned, she offered strength. Even as Anne Sullivan's health declined and she eventually passed away in 1936, Helen did not stop. The loss of her beloved teacher and companion was a devastating blow, yet Helen carried Anne's torch forward. She often said that everything she accomplished was because of Anne's unwavering belief. And in honoring Anne's memory, she pressed on, continuing their shared mission of lifting others. Helen's later years were marked by collaborations with new companions and helpers who supported her as Anne once had. With their assistance, she kept writing, lecturing, and traveling well into her 70s. Presidents, prime ministers, artists, and scientists sought her counsel. She was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1964 by President Lyndon B. Johnson, one of the highest civilian honors in the United States. She also received honorary doctorates from universities around the world, proof that the little girl once called unteachable had become one of the most respected minds of her generation. Yet Helen's greatest pride was not in awards or recognition, it was in the lives she touched. Schools for the blind opened in her honor, organizations for disability rights grew from her advocacy, and countless individuals drew strength from her story. Her life became a living proof that even the harshest limitations could be transformed into platforms of greatness. As Helen reflected on her journey, she often spoke about love as the guiding force of her life. She believed love had carried her through darkness, that love had been her real teacher. She once wrote, "Alone we can do so little, together we can do so much." In these words lay her legacy not just of knowledge, but of unity, compassion, and shared humanity. By the time Helen entered her 80s, she was celebrated not only as a champion for the blind and deaf but also as a moral leader of the human spirit. Her leadership did not come from wealth, sight, or sound. It came from courage, persistence, and an unshakable belief in the power of the human soul to rise above any obstacle. Helen Keller's later years showed the world that greatness does not fade with age. True leadership, rooted in love and purpose, only grows stronger with time. By the time Helen Keller reached the final chapters of her life, she was more than a woman, she was a symbol. Her story had been told in schools, in theaters, in books, and across every corner of the globe. She had walked into the lives of kings and queens, stood before parliaments, comforted war veterans, and inspired generations of students. She had done what once seemed impossible, she had turned silence into a voice that thundered through history, and darkness into a light that would never go out. In her later years, Helen slowed physically but never in spirit. She continued to meet with world leaders, authors, scientists, and activists, sharing her wisdom. Those who sat with her often left in tears, not out of pity, but out of awe. They realized they were in the presence of someone who had lived not just a life, but a legacy. On June 1, 1968, at the age of 87, Helen Keller passed away peacefully in her sleep at her home in Connecticut. The world mourned deeply, for it had lost not just a remarkable woman, but a living embodiment of resilience, courage, and hope. Newspapers across the globe carried her image, calling her a miracle, a heroine, a light in darkness. Leaders, from presidents to prime ministers, sent tributes honoring her as one of the greatest souls of the 20th century. But Helen Keller did not truly die, because legacies like hers cannot be buried. Her words continued to echo, "Keep your face to the sunshine and you cannot see the shadows." Her life remained a guidebook for anyone facing hardship, reminding them that adversity is not the end, but the beginning of greatness. Today, decades after her passing, Helen Keller's spirit still speaks. She is taught in classrooms as a symbol of perseverance. Her books still inspire readers searching for strength. Her story is retold in plays, films, and biographies, ensuring that new generations hear the message, "No obstacle is greater than the human will to rise." Monuments and schools bear her name, but her greatest monument is not made of stone, it lives in the millions of people who draw courage from her life. A blind child who dreams of becoming an artist, a deaf student who longs to attend university, a struggling adult who feels crushed by failure, all of them can look to Helen Keller and say, "If she could, then so can I." The little girl who once lived in silence and darkness became the eternal voice of courage and the everlasting light of hope. Helen Keller's story is not just history, it is a mirror held up to every soul who doubts, every heart that fears, and every spirit tempted to surrender. Her life declares with unshakable certainty, "We are stronger than our obstacles, greater than our circumstances, and capable of miracles when we refuse to give up." Helen Keller is gone, but her light still shines, forever, undimmed, eternal.